The Celestial Grand Hotel was the kind of place that made regular people feel uncomfortable just walking past it. It sat on Station Harmony, one of the largest space stations in the Outer Rim, and it catered exclusively to people who had more money and power than most folks could imagine. We're talking royalty from alien empires, CEOs who controlled entire star systems, diplomats who could start or end wars with a single conversation. The kind of guests who traveled with security details and expected everyone around them to know exactly who they were. The hotel didn't just maintain luxury through expensive furniture and fancy technology. They maintained it through rules. Lots and lots of rules. The staff handbook was 300 pages long, and about half of it dealt with how employees should interact with guests, which basically boiled down to, don't. Staff members were supposed to be invisible. You did your job, you kept your eyes down, you never initiated conversation with a guest unless they spoke to you first, and even then you kept your responses brief and formal. The hierarchy at the Celestial Grand was brutal and absolute. At the top were the guests, obviously. Below them were the guest services managers and concierges who actually interacted with these important people. Then came the various specialized staff like chefs and spa technicians. Somewhere near the bottom were the housekeepers and room service workers. And at the very bottom, barely acknowledged as human beings, were the janitors and maintenance crew who cleaned up after everyone else. Nathan Brooks had been working the night shift as a janitor at the Celestial Grand for 5 years. He was 40 years old, with graying hair that he kept cut short and a build that showed he'd done physical labor most of his life. He was originally from Detroit, back on Earth, where he'd worked at an automotive manufacturing plant for 15 years. Good job, decent pay, union benefits. Then the plant closed down, moved operations to an automated facility on Mars where robots did the work cheaper and faster. Nathan had spent 6 months looking for work on Earth before accepting reality. The manufacturing jobs weren't coming back. He needed income, and he needed it fast because his sister Kelly was raising his nephew Brandon alone after her husband walked out. Nathan helped with expenses when he could, and he wasn't going to let them down. So he took the job on Station Harmony, working nights at a luxury hotel, mopping floors and cleaning bathrooms for people who would never acknowledge his existence. The pay was actually decent by service industry standards. Station Harmony had a high cost of living, but Nathan was careful with his money. He lived in a small apartment in the working class section of the station, ate cheap meals, didn't spend money on entertainment he didn't need. Every month he sent a chunk of his paycheck back to Kelly to help with Brandon's school expenses and whatever else they needed. It wasn't the life Nathan had imagined for himself, but it was honest work and it helped his family. That mattered. Nathan had learned pretty quickly that invisibility was survival at a place like the Celestial Grand. You kept your head down, you did your job efficiently and without drawing attention, and you absolutely never got involved in guest business. He'd seen other employees get fired for small infractions. A housekeeper who lingered too long in a suite when a guest returned unexpectedly. A maintenance worker who tried to make friendly small talk with a corporate executive. The hotel didn't mess around. They had a reputation to maintain, and employees were expendable. So Nathan followed the rules. He worked his shift from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., which meant he rarely encountered guests anyway since most of them were either out at evening events or sleeping during his work hours. He cleaned the public areas, maintained the corridors, took care of whatever messes got left behind. It was repetitive and boring and sometimes demeaning, but it paid the bills. His routine was predictable and he liked it that way. He'd arrive at the hotel, check in with his supervisor, get his assignment for the night, and work through his checklist methodically. Public restrooms on levels 5 through 15. Main corridor floors on the guest levels. The observation deck if it wasn't being used for a private event. Emergency stairwells that guests never used but still had to be kept pristine just in case. He had it down to a science, knew exactly how long each task took, could time his breaks perfectly. The night everything changed started like any other night, except it was during the annual Galactic Summit. This was a huge event that brought together leaders and royalty from dozens of different civilizations. The hotel was packed with VIPs, security was everywhere, and the staff had been warned repeatedly that any mistakes during the summit would result in immediate termination. The pressure was intense. Nathan's regular routine got disrupted that night because 3 of the housekeeping staff who normally handled the penthouse levels called in sick. Food poisoning from a cheap restaurant in the station's lower levels, apparently. Management was scrambling to cover the shifts, and Nathan got pulled to work areas he normally never accessed. The penthouse level was where the most important guests stayed, the ones who paid obscene amounts for suites bigger than most people's houses. He'd been up there for about an hour, working his way down one of the marble-floored corridors with his cleaning cart, when he heard something that made him stop. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the station's environmental systems. But as Nathan paused to listen, he realized what it was. Someone was crying. Nathan stood there for a moment, mop in hand, debating with himself. Protocol said he should call guest services and let them handle it. Protocol said he should absolutely not investigate on his own. Protocol said that lower-tier staff engaging with distressed VIP guests without authorization was grounds for immediate dismissal. But Nathan was also a human being with basic decency, and he'd raised a nephew who'd had plenty of moments of tears and heartbreak. He knew what genuine distress sounded like, and this wasn't some minor inconvenience. Whoever was crying sounded absolutely heartbroken. He followed the sound to a small alcove near the emergency stairwell, a spot that was probably meant for decorative purposes but provided a bit of privacy from the main corridor. And there, sitting on the floor with her knees drawn up and her face buried in her hands, was a young woman who was clearly one of the summit guests. Nathan barely had time to process what was happening before he was escorted away from the alcove by hotel security. Two large guards, one human and one from a species Nathan didn't recognize, took him by the arms and walked him quickly through service corridors away from the guest areas. Princess Lyra was calling after them, trying to explain that Nathan hadn't done anything wrong, but her own royal guards were already surrounding her and moving her in the opposite direction. They put Nathan in a small, windowless security office deep in the hotel's administrative section. It was the kind of room designed to make people uncomfortable: harsh lighting, a metal table bolted to the floor, chairs that were deliberately just uncomfortable enough to keep you off balance. Nathan had never been in trouble in his life, not even a traffic ticket, and sitting in that interrogation room felt surreal and terrifying. The questions started almost immediately. First it was hotel security, led by a man named Chief Williams who Nathan had seen around but never actually spoken to. Williams was professional but cold, treating Nathan like he was already guilty of something serious. He wanted to know everything. How long had Nathan been planning to make contact with Princess Lyra? Who had told him she'd be in that corridor at that specific time? What information had he been trying to extract from her? Nathan tried to explain that there was no plan, no conspiracy. He'd heard someone crying and went to help. That's it. Williams didn't believe him. In his experience, nothing happened by accident in a luxury hotel during a major diplomatic summit. There were always angles, always ulterior motives. Then the Altrian diplomatic security showed up, and things got much worse. These weren't hotel employees concerned about liability and reputation. These were professionals who protected royalty in a galaxy where assassination and espionage were real threats. They were polite but intimidating, asking the same questions over and over in slightly different ways, looking for inconsistencies in Nathan's story. What exactly did you discuss with Princess Lyra? Be specific. Who do you work for besides the hotel? Have you had any contact with Kelleran agents? Do you have gambling debts or financial problems that might make you vulnerable to recruitment? Have you ever been approached by anyone asking questions about hotel security or guest schedules? Nathan answered truthfully every time. He was a janitor. He worked nights, sent money to his sister on Earth, and minded his own business. He talked to the princess about nothing important, just life stuff, feelings, being trapped by circumstances. He wasn't a spy or an agent or anything except a guy who saw someone upset and tried to help. But the more he insisted on this simple truth, the less believable it seemed to sound to his interrogators. In their world of political intrigue and power plays, genuine compassion without agenda apparently didn't exist. Nobody did something kind just because it was the right thing to do. There was always an angle, always something to gain. The interrogation went on for 2 hours. Nathan was exhausted, confused, and increasingly worried about what was going to happen to him. He kept asking if he was under arrest, if he needed a lawyer, what exactly he was being accused of. The answers were vague and unhelpful. He wasn't technically under arrest, but he wasn't free to leave either. They were conducting a security investigation, and his cooperation was mandatory. Around 4 in the morning, the Altrian security personnel finally seemed satisfied that Nathan was either telling the truth or was the world's best liar. They left without apologizing or explaining what would happen next. Chief Williams stayed behind and told Nathan to wait. So he waited, sitting in that uncomfortable chair, staring at the blank walls, wondering how his life had gone so completely wrong in the span of a few hours. At 6:30 in the morning, right when Nathan's shift would normally be ending, the hotel's general manager arrived. His name was Overseer Thane, and he was a Corinthian, one of those species that looked vaguely reptilian and always seemed cold and calculating. Thane had been the general manager for 3 years, and Nathan had maybe seen him in person 5 times. Upper management didn't interact with janitors. Thane sat down across from Nathan and got straight to the point. Mr. Brooks, your employment with the Celestial Grand Hotel is terminated effective immediately. You violated protocol by engaging with a VIP guest without authorization. You created a security incident during our most important event of the year. You've damaged the hotel's reputation with one of our most valued client groups. Nathan tried to explain what actually happened, but Thane held up a hand to stop him. I don't doubt that you believed you were being helpful. But intent doesn't matter. The Altrian delegation is furious that one of our staff had unsupervised contact with their princess. They are questioning our security measures and threatening to never book with us again. We have to show them that we take this seriously. So I'm being fired for checking on someone who was crying? Nathan asked, his voice coming out more bitter than he'd intended. You're being fired for breaking the most fundamental rule of service in a luxury establishment, Thane corrected him. Staff do not engage with VIP guests. Ever. For any reason. You call guest services and let trained personnel handle the situation. You knew this rule. It's in the handbook, it's in your training, it's posted in every staff area. What made it worse was that Thane wasn't being cruel or enjoying this. He actually seemed regretful. You were a good employee, Mr. Brooks. In 5 years, you never had a single complaint, never missed a shift, never caused problems. But this isn't a situation where I can show leniency. The hotel needs to demonstrate to the Altrian Empire that we take their security concerns seriously, and that means there have to be consequences. Nathan asked about severance or references, and Thane's expression made it clear those weren't options. This is termination with cause. That means no severance package. And I can't give you a reference when you were fired for a serious protocol violation. I'm sorry, but that's how it has to be. The real killer was what Thane said next. I'm also required to file a report with Station Harmony Employment Services noting the reason for your termination. That report goes into your permanent employment record. Any future employer will see it when they run a background check. Nathan felt his stomach drop. He'd just been blacklisted. In the service industry, especially on space stations where the hospitality sector was huge, a termination with cause for violating guest security protocols was basically a career death sentence. No reputable hotel, restaurant, or service establishment would hire him. Nathan said yes to the job offer from the Altrian Empire because turning it down would have been insane. 3 days ago he'd been unemployed and blacklisted with 2 months of savings and no prospects. Now he was being offered a position that paid 10 times his janitor salary, came with housing and benefits, and had the protection of one of the most powerful empires in the galaxy. It was the kind of opportunity that didn't happen to people like him. Ever. But accepting the job and actually doing the job turned out to be two very different things. Nathan quickly discovered that working for an imperial family was way more complicated than mopping floors had ever been. The first shock was the apartment. Ambassador Miller took him to the Altrian Embassy complex, which occupied an entire section of Station Harmony's diplomatic quarter. The building was massive, beautiful, and clearly designed to impress. They took him up to the residential levels, and Nathan assumed he'd be getting some small efficiency unit, maybe a room with a bathroom and a kitchenette. Instead, they showed him to a 3-bedroom apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the station's central plaza. There was a living room bigger than his entire previous apartment, a full kitchen with appliances he didn't know how to use, and a bathroom with a tub you could practically swim in. The furniture looked like it belonged in a museum, and there was actual art on the walls. Nathan stood in the middle of this apartment and felt completely out of place. "There's been a mistake," he said. "This is way too much. I just need something basic." Ambassador Miller smiled. "This is the standard housing for embassy cultural liaisons. You're representing the Altrian Empire now, Mr. Brooks. Your living situation reflects that position." Then they introduced him to his personal assistant, a young Altrian woman named Kira who couldn't have been more than 25. Her job, apparently, was to help Nathan navigate the incredibly complex world of diplomatic protocol and imperial etiquette. She gave him a datapad loaded with information about Altrian customs, embassy procedures, dress codes, and about a million other things he was supposed to learn. The clothes were another adjustment. Nathan's entire wardrobe consisted of work uniforms and a few casual outfits. Now he was being given formal attire that probably cost more than he used to make in a month. Tailored pants that felt weird after years of wearing cheap work clothes. Shirts made from fabric so soft it was almost unsettling. Jackets that fit perfectly because they'd been custom-made based on his measurements. He felt like a kid playing dress-up in his dad's clothes. The first time he looked at himself in the mirror wearing this fancy outfit, he didn't recognize the person staring back. He looked like someone important, someone who mattered, and that feeling was deeply uncomfortable for a guy who'd spent 5 years being invisible. His actual job responsibilities were explained during his first official meeting with Princess Lyra, which happened 2 days after he moved into the embassy. He was nervous as hell, not sure how to act now that everything was formal and official. Their previous conversation had been spontaneous and real. Now there were protocols to follow, other people in the room, and the weight of his new position pressing down on him. Lyra looked different in this setting too. She was wearing formal robes that marked her royal status, and her hair was styled in an elaborate way that probably took someone an hour to arrange. But when she started talking, he recognized the same person he'd met crying in that hotel alcove. "I need someone who can help me understand how ordinary people think and live," she explained. "I'm creating a xenobiological research foundation that will operate across multiple star systems. I want it to be accessible to scientists from all backgrounds, not just the elite who can afford expensive educations or have connections to prestigious institutions." She explained that too many scientific organizations were run by people who'd never struggled financially, never had to work a regular job, never experienced what life was like for the vast majority of beings in the galaxy. Their policies and procedures reflected that privilege, creating barriers that kept out talented people who didn't fit the traditional mold. "Your role," Lyra continued, "is to be honest with me about how our policies and decisions will affect regular working people. I need someone who won't just tell me what I want to hear, who'll point out when we're making assumptions based on privilege or creating obstacles we don't realize exist." It sounded simple enough in theory, but Nathan had no idea how to actually do this job. He was a high school graduate who'd worked in a factory and then cleaned floors. What did he know about running a scientific research foundation? But Lyra seemed to understand his hesitation. "I don't need you to be a scientist or an administrator. I have plenty of those. I need you to be yourself, someone who's lived the kind of life most people in positions of power never experience." That perspective is valuable precisely because it's rare in these spaces. The first few weeks were incredibly awkward. Nathan didn't know how to talk to a princess in this official capacity. Should he call her Princess Lyra? "Your Highness?" Kira gave him a whole briefing on proper forms of address, but it all felt stiff and wrong. During their first few meetings, Nathan was so worried about following protocol that he could barely contribute anything useful. Lyra seemed equally uncomfortable with the formal dynamic. She'd call these meetings and they'd sit across from each other in her office, and there'd be this weird tension because they both remembered that real conversation they'd had but didn't know how to recreate it in this new context. The breakthrough came during their 5th or 6th meeting, when they were discussing plans for the Foundation's first research facility. Lyra was explaining the application process they'd developed, which involved extensive documentation of educational credentials and research experience. Nathan was nodding along, not really saying much, when something occurred to him. "Can I ask a question?" he said hesitantly. "Of course. That's literally your job. This application process, it requires people to submit transcripts from accredited universities and letters of recommendation from established researchers, right?" "Yes. That's standard for academic positions." "Okay, but what about someone like my sister's kid, Brandon? He's crazy smart, obsessed with biology and chemistry. But he goes to an underfunded public school on Earth where the science labs barely work. Say he somehow manages to get into college, he'd probably have to go to a cheap state school because that's all we could afford. Would his application even be looked at seriously compared to someone from a prestigious academy?" Lyra was quiet for a moment, actually thinking about this. "Probably not," she admitted. "The review committee would likely prioritize candidates from well-known institutions." Things had been going surprisingly well for about 6 weeks when everything exploded. Nathan was starting to feel comfortable in his role, and Princess Lyra's research foundation was making real progress. They'd worked out application processes that were actually fair, established funding for scientists from disadvantaged backgrounds, and even started recruiting for their first facility. Nathan was proud of what they were building. Then Prince Kellier showed up at Station Harmony, and the whole situation went sideways fast. Nathan learned about it from Kira, his assistant, who came to his apartment early one morning looking worried. "Prince Kellier of the Kelleran Empire just arrived without advance notice," she told him. "He's demanding an immediate meeting with Princess Lyra and Emperor Theron. This is bad." Nathan didn't know much about Prince Kellier except what Lyra had told him during that first conversation in the hotel corridor. He was the prince she was supposed to marry as part of a political alliance. When Lyra had convinced her father to let her postpone the wedding to focus on her research foundation, the Kelleran Empire had officially accepted the delay, but privately they'd been furious about it. Apparently, 6 weeks was how long it took for that private fury to turn into public confrontation. Prince Kellier was everything you'd expect from someone called a warrior prince. He was tall, powerfully built, covered in traditional Kelleran battle tattoos, and carried himself like someone who'd never been told no in his entire life. His species was humanoid but more intimidating, with features that looked like they'd been carved from stone. He arrived with a full security detail and made sure everyone on the station knew he was there. The meeting he demanded turned into a formal diplomatic dinner, because apparently that's how royal families handled confrontations. Emperor Theron, Lyra's father, decided to address the situation head-on rather than let it fester. The dinner was scheduled for the embassy's Grand Hall, with representatives from multiple empires attending as witnesses. It was going to be a show, and everyone knew it. Nathan found out he was required to attend when Kira showed up at his apartment with formal attire even fancier than what he usually wore. As Princess Lyra's cultural liaison and advisor, you're expected to be present, she explained, helping him figure out how all the formal robes and sashes were supposed to be worn. I don't think I should be there, Nathan protested. This is way above my pay grade. This is royal politics and diplomatic stuff. I'm just a guy who used to mop floors. Kira gave him a sympathetic look. I understand you're nervous, but Princess Lyra specifically requested your presence. She wants you there. The dinner was held in the embassy's most impressive room, a hall with ceilings so high they made you feel tiny and walls decorated with Altrian art that was probably priceless. Long tables were arranged in a U-shape, with Emperor Theron at the center head table and various dignitaries seated according to some complex hierarchy that Nathan didn't understand. Nathan was seated near Lyra, close enough to be identified as part of her delegation but not so close that he'd be expected to actively participate. He'd never been in a room full of alien royalty and diplomats before, and he was completely out of his depth. Everyone else knew the protocols, understood the subtle power dynamics, could read the unspoken messages in seating arrangements and formal greetings. Nathan just tried to sit still and not knock over his water glass. Prince Kellier sat across from Lyra, and the tension between them was obvious even before anyone said a word. The prince kept staring at her with an expression that mixed anger and something possessive that made Nathan uncomfortable. Lyra kept her eyes down, focused on her plate, and Nathan could see her hands trembling slightly. The dinner started with the usual diplomatic pleasantries. Various representatives gave formal greetings, Emperor Theron welcomed everyone, servants brought out elaborate courses of food that Nathan couldn't identify. Everyone was being polite on the surface, but you could feel the hostility underneath like a storm building. Prince Kellier waited until the third course before he made his move. He stood up, which apparently was a signal that he was about to make a formal statement. The room went quiet, and everyone turned to look at him. Emperor Theron, Princess Lyra, honored guests, he began, his voice carrying across the hall. I've come here today to address a situation that has caused great concern for the Kelleran Empire. 6 weeks ago, Princess Lyra requested a postponement of our arranged marriage so that she could pursue what was described as important scientific work. The Kelleran Empire, respecting the wisdom of the Altrian throne, accepted this delay. He paused, and his expression hardened. However, it has come to our attention that this scientific work is actually a distraction from the princess's duties. More concerning, we've learned that Princess Lyra has been influenced by unsuitable elements that do not have her best interests, or the interests of our allied empires, at heart. Nathan felt every eye in the room shift toward him. It was pretty clear who the unsuitable elements were. Prince Kellier didn't even try to be subtle about it. He looked directly at Nathan when he continued speaking. We have learned that a former service worker, someone with no diplomatic training, no understanding of imperial politics, and no appropriate credentials, has been elevated to a position of influence over the princess. This person has encouraged her to abandon her responsibilities and pursue inappropriate activities. This is unacceptable. Lyra started to stand up, probably to defend Nathan, but her father placed a hand on her arm and she sat back down. Emperor Theron's expression was unreadable, but Nathan got the feeling he was carefully calculating his response. Prince Kellier wasn't finished. I propose that this unfortunate situation be resolved immediately. Princess Lyra should return with me to the Kelleran Empire, where we can proceed with our marriage as originally planned. This will restore the diplomatic alliance between our peoples and remove her from the inappropriate influences that have led her astray. I suggest we make the formal announcement tonight and hold the wedding ceremony within the month. The room erupted in whispered conversations. Nathan sat frozen, not sure what to do or say. This prince was basically demanding that Lyra be handed over immediately, treating her like property that needed to be retrieved before it got damaged. And he was blaming Nathan for everything, painting him as some kind of manipulator who'd led the princess astray. Nathan looked at Lyra and saw that trapped expression he remembered from their first meeting. She looked terrified, like walls were closing in around her and there was no way out. Princess Lyra published her xenobiological research 3 weeks after the disastrous dinner with Prince Kellier. Nathan had encouraged her to do it, told her that the truth mattered more than political comfort, and now he was watching the galaxy lose its collective mind over the implications. The research itself was brilliant and groundbreaking. Lyra had spent years analyzing genetic data from dozens of different species across the galaxy, looking for patterns and connections. What she found changed everything. There was evidence of ancient genetic engineering on a massive scale, suggesting that many of the species currently inhabiting the galaxy, including humans and Altarians, shared common modified ancestors from millions of years ago. The scientific community went crazy with excitement. Researchers who'd been working on similar theories suddenly had the data to prove them. Universities wanted to replicate her findings. Academic journals were fighting over publication rights. For scientists, this was the discovery of the century, maybe the discovery of the millennium. But for everyone else, the implications were terrifying. The research basically proved that the rigid species hierarchies that many empires were built on were artificial constructs. The idea that certain species were naturally superior, that bloodlines determined worth, that royal families had some genetic destiny to rule, all of that was undermined by Lyra's findings. If everyone shared modified common ancestors, then claims of genetic superiority were nonsense. Religious leaders were split down the middle. Some saw the research as proof of universal connection, evidence that all intelligent life was fundamentally related. Others saw it as heresy, a challenge to creation myths and divine order that their followers had believed for thousands of years. There were protests outside Altarian embassies on a dozen different worlds, some supporting the research and others demanding it be denounced as lies. Politicians panicked the hardest because they understood what this meant for power structures. Empires that justified their rule through claims of superior bloodlines suddenly had a problem. Noble families who'd maintained privilege for generations based on genetic purity were facing questions they couldn't answer. The research threatened to destabilize governments across the galaxy. The Altarian Empire faced enormous pressure from other governments to walk back the research, to claim it was flawed or premature, to punish those responsible for creating such chaos. Trade agreements were threatened. Diplomatic relationships became strained. Other empires made it clear that there would be consequences if the Altarians continued supporting this work. Inside the Altarian government, Lord Varon led the opposition. He was the noble who'd arranged Lyra's marriage to Prince Kellier in the first place, and he'd been working to undermine Nathan since day one. Now he had the ammunition he needed. He argued in council meetings that Princess Lyra had damaged the Empire's reputation, destroyed crucial alliances, and created political chaos that would take years to repair. And he made sure everyone knew who to blame. This disaster stems from allowing inappropriate influences to guide Princess Lyra, Varon declared during one particularly heated council session. A former janitor with no education, no understanding of politics, and no respect for tradition has led our princess into making decisions that threaten our empire's stability. Nathan Brooks must be removed from his position and sent back to Earth immediately. We must show the galaxy that the Altarian Empire takes responsibility for this mess. The calls for Nathan's removal grew louder. Some council members genuinely believed he was a bad influence. Others just wanted a scapegoat, someone to blame so they could move past the crisis. There were formal petitions demanding his deportation, editorials and Altarian news media questioning how someone so unqualified had been given such influence, and not so subtle hints that Nathan's continued presence was damaging diplomatic relationships. Nathan knew he was in trouble. He'd been through enough in his life to recognize when people were looking for someone to sacrifice, and he was the obvious choice. He was prepared to resign, to go back to Earth quietly, to let Lyra and her father handle the political fallout without him making things worse. But then something unexpected happened. The story of Nathan, the whole story, from getting fired for helping a crying princess to encouraging revolutionary scientific research despite political pressure, went viral across the galaxy. Someone had leaked recordings of that first conversation between Nathan and Lyra in the hotel corridor. Someone else had released footage of Nathan standing up to Prince Kellier at the diplomatic dinner. News organizations picked up the story and ran with it because it had everything: drama, romance, ordinary person versus powerful elites, scientific revolution, political intrigue. The narrative that emerged wasn't the one Lord Varon wanted. Instead of seeing Nathan as an inappropriate influence, billions of beings across hundreds of worlds saw him as a symbol. He represented ordinary people standing up to power structures, choosing compassion over career advancement, supporting truth even when it was politically inconvenient. On Earth, Nathan became a folk hero overnight. Here was a guy from Detroit who'd lost his factory job, worked as a janitor, got fired for being decent to someone in distress, and then somehow ended up helping reshape galactic politics. Working-class communities loved the story because it was one of their own making a difference. Young people loved it because it challenged the idea that only the wealthy and well-connected mattered. But the support wasn't just coming from humans. Workers' movements on alien worlds started using Nathan's image in their protests, arguing that if a janitor could influence an empire, then maybe regular people deserved more voice in their governments. Students demonstrated in support of Lyra's research, carrying signs that said things like truth over politics and science doesn't care about your bloodline. The galactic social media networks exploded with discussion. There were millions of posts debating the research, sharing the story, defending both Lyra and Nathan against critics. Artists created images and videos celebrating what they were calling the Janitor Revolution. Musicians wrote songs about it. It became a cultural phenomenon that governments couldn't control or suppress. The Celestial Grand Hotel, where this all started, faced massive public backlash. People were furious that they'd fired Nathan for showing compassion. There were calls for boycotts, negative reviews flooding their systems, protests outside their location on Station Harmony. The hotel's management tried to do damage control by issuing a public apology and offering Nathan his job back with a promotion and a huge raise. Nathan, in a moment that became famous, declined on a live news interview with a simple statement, "I appreciate the offer, but I'm right where I'm supposed to be." Support poured in from unexpected places. Scientists from dozens of institutions publicly endorsed Lyra's research and offered their own funding and resources. Some younger members of alien nobility spoke out in support, saying they were tired of traditions that didn't make sense and hierarchies based on birth rather than merit. Even some religious leaders came forward arguing that understanding the truth of creation was more important than protecting comfortable myths. Emperor Theron watched all of this unfold and made a calculated political decision. Instead of backing down and apologizing, he doubled down. He gave a speech announcing that the Altrian Empire was proud to lead this scientific revolution, that seeking truth was more important than maintaining comfortable lies, and that Princess Lyra's research represented the best of what their civilization could achieve.